On that cloudy Seoul morning, the sky seemed to weep for someone who didn't yet know how much they were about to lose. In the cold hospital room, where the white walls mingled with the smell of antiseptic and goodbye, Kang Jae-min stood motionless before the woman he had once promised to love above all else. Dressed in his perfectly tailored suit, the man the world saw as a symbol of power and perfection hid a heart that no longer knew how to love what it couldn't show. Before him, Yoon Ha-eun, once admired for her beauty and charisma, now struggled against the cruel reflection of the disease that had transformed her. The scarf on her head was not a sign of weakness, but of courage. Still, he looked at her as if contemplating something he'd rather forget. "Do you still love me?" she asked, her voice trembling, almost begging for a shred of humanity. Jae-min looked away, unable to bear the weight of his own cowardice. The silence that followed was more devastating than any answer. Then, he turned and walked to the door, leaving behind the sound of the heart monitor and an expensive perfume that failed to mask the smell of abandonment. As the door closed, Ha-eun understood that his love hadn't died. It had merely turned to fear. But what would happen when fate brought together the man who fled from pain and the woman who learned to be reborn from it? If this story has already piqued your curiosity, subscribe now and leave a like. Because what follows will show that not every abandonment means the end, and some twists and turns are impossible to forget. Before illness reduced her to a frail, pale body, Yoon Ha-eun was the woman who made Kang Jae-min smile, even when he pretended he had no time for love. They met at a fashion event when she was still a fledgling model and he was an arrogant businessman on the rise. That night, under the lights of Seoul, he was struck by the discreet sparkle in her eyes. There was something about Ha-eun that disarmed him, a purity that contrasted with the competitive and superficial world around him. She loved him completely, without reservation, believing that true love would be enough to weather any storm. In their glory days, they were inseparable. He called her his muse, and she believed she would be forever. But the forever began to crumble the moment the illness arrived, without warning. At first, he feigned strength. He brought flowers, promised patience, said he would stay by her side until the end. However, as the treatment progressed and the mirror reflected a different woman, the visits became shorter, the glances more evasive. The fear of losing his status, of being seen with someone imperfect, consumed him from the inside out, turning love into shame. Ha-eun sensed the distance even before he left. There was something in his eyes, an absence that hurt more than any diagnosis. During the long days in the hospital, she clung to memories like a rope about to snap. He remembered the promises made by the river, the laughter in the icy wind, and the words that now sounded like lies. "I will love you no matter what." That voice still echoed, but the man who had spoken it was gone. Through tears and loneliness, Ha-eun clutched the ring to her chest and whispered that she would survive. Not for him, but for herself. She believed there was something to be recovered, a dignity that neither illness nor abandonment could steal. Behind the pain, a silent, invisible force was born, yet one poised to change everything. Love, once her weakness, was beginning to transform into fuel. It was the beginning of a new kind of promise, no longer made to another, but to herself. And when love dies, something within the soul awakens, a flame that only suffering can ignite. What Ha-eun didn't yet know was that life was about to deal her the cruelest blow yet. One that would come not from illness, but from the man who once swore to protect her. The sound of rain beating against the windows was the only noise filling the luxurious apartment where, for years, Ha-eun had believed herself safe. Her suitcases lined the floor, cold and silent as the fate that awaited her. Kang Jae-min stood near the door, his expression one of someone who had already decided everything before even opening his mouth. She tried to smile, still believing there was room for dialogue, but he looked away, avoiding the weight of guilt. In a cold, calculated voice, he announced that he needed time that he couldn't bear. To see her in that state, and that the best thing for both of them would be to separate. Each word was a blade that cut too deep to heal. Ha-eun felt her legs weaken, but she stood up straight, trying to maintain a modicum of dignity in front of the man she loved. Tears began to fall without permission, betraying the pain her body could no longer contain. She reached out, touching his arm, but he stepped back, as if her touch were a weight he no longer wanted to carry. He said he needed to focus on the company, that the investors demanded his image remain intact. Behind this excuse, what really drove him was fear. Fear of others' gaze, of judgment, of being associated with weakness. She watched him walk down the hallway without looking back, his shadow vanishing with the sound of the door closing forever. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the sound of thunder filled the night, mingling with the sobs echoing off the walls. Ha-eun fell to her knees, clutching the scarf, covering her head, and when the wind ripped it away, revealing the nakedness of her pain, she didn't stop it. She let the world see her as she was, stripped of vanity but full of truth. On the wet sidewalk, the cold bit her skin, but what hurt most was the emptiness. People hurried past, some averted their eyes, others just watched in pity, but no one stopped. The loneliness that night was crueler than cancer because she could treat the disease, the abandonment. She couldn't. As the rain mingled with her tears, Ha-eun realized that the love she had sworn would last forever was too fragile to withstand the ugliness of reality. It was on that wet ground that she swore that if fate ever gave her another chance, it wouldn't be to win him back, but to be reborn before him. The wind blew hard, sweeping away the last memories of the past, and for the first time, she lifted her face to the sky and let the water wash away all the remaining pain. But the universe has a strange way of rewarding broken hearts. Sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to discover that there's new ground waiting, and hers would begin to rebuild in a way that even Kang Jae-min couldn't ignore. The following days were a bitter mix of silence and survival. Ha-eun woke and slept, surrounded by medicine, scars, and memories. Every step inside that small rented apartment was a reminder of everything she had lost: love, trust, her own self-image. For weeks, she could barely look at her reflection. The mirror returned, a woman she didn't recognize, and that hurt more than the needles or the chemotherapy. But just as despair seemed about to overcome her, the sound of a familiar voice cut through the silence. It was Seo Min-ju, an old friend from her catwalk days who, upon learning of her situation, appeared unannounced, bringing hot soup and a look that mixed affection and firmness. Min-ju showed no pity, and perhaps that was the greatest gift. "You're not a sick body, Ha-eun. You're a soul that has forgotten." "Who it is," she said, as she rearranged the room and filled the air with the scent of ginger tea. That night, the two talked for hours. Min-ju spoke of her own downfalls, the days when she, too, had been forgotten by the industry and by the people who claimed to love her. It was listening to those stories that Ha-eun realized perhaps suffering was not an end, but a starting point. Inspired by this new lease on life, she began sewing again. She took simple fabrics, scraps of donated cloth, and created scarves for women who, like her, had lost their hair. Each stitch was a silent prayer, each fold a piece of her heart trying to reassemble itself. She sewed in the early hours of the morning, amidst tears and hope, and little by little pain gave way to creation. That small makeshift workshop began to flourish. Other women, also undergoing treatment, began seeking her out, not just for the scarves, but for her words. Ha-eun became a source of strength without realizing it. Her drawings conveyed courage, and the sparkle in her eyes flared like embers after a storm. One night, after finishing another piece, she took a photo and posted it on social media with a simple caption, "Beauty is what remains when everything else is gone." What seemed like a simple rant turned into the beginning of something bigger. Days later, a notification flashed on my phone screen, a message from France. The sender, Renault House, one of the most respected fashion houses in Paris. The short text read, "We saw your creations. Get in touch. There's a project we'd like to discuss." Ha-eun stood there for minutes, unable to breathe. Her heart pounded as if trying to make up for all the days she'd been silent. The woman who'd been rejected and forgotten had just received a call from the other side of the world. And so it was that, from the depths of the pit, the first step of a new life was born. Fate, however, would not only invite her to be reborn, it would also prepare the stage where her pain would be transformed into power, and where the man who abandoned her would be forced to witness every step of this ascent. 2 years had passed since the night the rain washed away her pain. Time, merciless and generous, had shaped a new woman. Paris was now her home, and the distant sound of the Seine accompanied the beats of a life beginning again. Ha-eun walked the streets with the confidence of someone who had faced death and overcome it. Her eyes, once filled with tears, now reflected calm and determination. Her hair, which had grown back, fell to her shoulders like a symbol of rebirth. She was no longer the rejected wife of a CEO. She was an artist who transformed scars into art. A Renault house had become her second home. The atelier smelled of new fabric, strong coffee, and restored dreams. Ha-eun created with soul. Each piece told a story of overcoming adversity, and fashion editors began to take notice. French magazines published articles about the Korean designer who sows courage. Models smiled as they wore her clothes, feeling something different, as if each line were a silent embrace. But Ha-eun's true rebirth wasn't just in recognition. It was in the mirror. She could now look at herself and see not what cancer had destroyed, but what strength had rebuilt. On cold nights, she would sit on the balcony of her small apartment, cup of tea in her hands, watching the city lights. Paris didn't make her forget the pain, but it taught her that pain can be a bridge. She thought of Kang Jae-min from time to time, not with resentment, but with a kind of peace that comes only when the heart finally understands that some people hurt us, not because they're bad, but because they're too small to be with us. One morning, while adjusting the fabric for a new collection, an assistant hurried in with a black envelope. Ha-eun opened the invitation and stood motionless for a few seconds. At the top was the name of the sponsoring brand, Light, the same company that had once belonged to Jae-min. The event would be the biggest international fashion show of the year, and her name was on the list of invited designers. For a moment, the air seemed to vanish. The past, which she thought she had buried, now resurfaced in the form of a golden invitation. Min-ju entered the room and noticed her expression. "Are you going?" she asked cautiously. Ha-eun took a deep breath, held up the paper, and replied with a half-smile, "Yes, but not to prove anything to him. I'm going to show the world that I won." In the following days, she immersed herself in her work as if she were weaving her own destiny. Silk, fabrics, and silver threads took shape under her steady hands. She created a collection inspired by the light that emerges after pain, dresses that flowed like dawns, each symbolizing a stage of healing. The collection's name would be Reborn. News of her participation spread quickly across Korean fashion portals. Journalists began comparing her trajectory to that of a Phoenix and comments multiplied on social media. The woman who the CEO of Light abandoned will now be featured in the brand's own fashion show. It was the kind of irony that fate writes with indelible ink. On the eve of the event, Ha-eun looked out the window and saw the reflection of the illuminated Eiffel Tower. She smiled slightly. The city that welcomed her would be the stage for the meeting of past and future, the place where she would cease to be remembered as a victim and become a symbol. But on the other side of the world, someone else would receive an invitation. And when Kang Jae-min read the name Yoon Ha-eun on the list of participants for the Paris show, he realized that no empire would be enough to hide the ghost of the woman he himself helped transform into a legend. While Ha-eun flourished under the lights of Paris, Kang Jae-min seemed to reign supreme in Seoul. His brand, Light, had become an empire of fashion and influence. Magazines plastered his face as an example of entrepreneurial genius. The public saw him as a successful, admirable, unbeatable man. But what the cameras didn't show was the weight of silence when the lights went out. The apartment where he lived, surrounded by luxury and technology, was as cold as the look in the mirror. The man who once believed he had it all now found himself surrounded by nothing. The nights were long. The sound of the clock echoed through the room, reminding him that time passed, but satisfaction never came. He drank. More than before, tried to drown his loneliness in glasses of expensive whiskey, but the bitter taste always returned, the same taste he'd felt the day he left the hospital room. Sometimes he dreamed of Ha-eun. In the dream, she still looked at him tenderly, and he tried to reach her, but something held him back. When he woke, he realized the tenderness had disappeared, and what remained was only the regret he tried to hide even from himself. His business advisors noticed his distraction, but none of them dared question him. Jae-min had become even more meticulous, rigid, as if trying to fill his emotional void with absolute control. But the more success grew, the more it suffocated him. He was living proof that glory without peace is just another form of prison. One morning during a meeting, his aide walked in with a tablet in hand and a hesitant expression. President Kang, Renault House, confirmed the names of the designers invited to the Paris show, he said, sliding the screen until the name flashed before him. Yoon Ha-eun. For a few seconds, time stood still. The air seemed thin. The voices around him became distant noise. He stared at that name, and a mixture of surprise, pain, and disbelief filled his chest. "Is she still alive?" he asked quietly, unaware of everyone's eyes. The aide nodded. "And it looks like she'll be the main attraction." His hands shook for a moment, but he quickly hid them. Ending the meeting, he walked to the window and surveyed the city he once believed he dominated. For the first time, the Seoul skyline seemed too small. In the following days, he researched every news story about Ha-eun. He watched interviews, read articles, saw photos of her smiling, different, radiant, unapproachable. Each image was a silent stab. The woman he had abandoned at the height of her weakness was now celebrated as an example of strength. This consumed him, not out of envy, but out of belated regret. He realized he no longer recognized her, and perhaps that was the greatest punishment. Realizing she had become everything he had always wanted to be, but never achieved. That night, sitting in front of the fireplace, the reflection of the flames danced in his eyes. An invitation lay on the table. The same event, the same parade, but now in a different position. He would be merely a spectator. He smiled bitterly, knowing that fate, in its irony, was about to place him before the woman he had destroyed, and that now he would confront the truth he had spent his life running from. And so, with wounded pride and a restless heart, Kang Jae-min set off for Paris. He thought he was just going to a business event, But what awaited him there would be much more than a fashion show. It would be the beginning of the silent judgment that fate had prepared under the relentless glare of the catwalk lights. The great hall of the Grand Palais Étoile was filled with a glow that seemed to traverse time. Spotlights crisscrossed the ceiling like moving stars, and the sound of cameras echoed in an almost sacred rhythm. That night, Paris was the center of the fashion world, and unbeknownst to him, it would also be the stage where the past and present would collide for the first time. Kang Jae-min arrived accompanied by aides, maintaining his usual demeanor, cold, calculated, impenetrable. Inside, however, something trembled. Each step echoed like a memory, and anticipation gnawed at him. He had read her name so many times in the last few weeks that it seemed to be tattooed on his mind. As the show began, the first models walked down the runway, dressed in shimmering fabrics and impeccable cuts. He watched everything with professional interest until the master of ceremonies announced, "We now present the Renaissance collection, designed by Korean designer Yoon Ha-eun." In that instant, the surrounding sound dissolved. The soft music faded to a distant murmur, and time seemed to stand still. Jaemin's heart pounded, reminding him that he still existed, and it hurt. She appeared at the end of the runway. Ha-eun was dressed in a silver gown that reflected the light like a liquid mirror. Her hair now formed delicate waves that framed her serene face, and her steady gaze contrasted with the fragility of the one he'd left behind. There was no anger, no resentment, just an unattainable elegance, as if she'd made peace with the world and with herself. When their eyes met, the air felt thin. He wanted to stand up, say something, but his throat betrayed him. Ha-eun walked to the end of the catwalk and, before taking the stage, stopped in front of him. For a brief second, the two stood face to face. The audience, oblivious to what was happening, continued to applaud, thinking it was part of the performance. She leaned in slightly and whispered in a voice soothing yet firm enough to tear at his soul, "Thank you for leaving me." And then he smiled. A light smile, full of meaning, without a trace of pain. Then he turned and walked onto the stage, receiving applause that seemed to come from fate itself. Jaemin remained motionless, trying to process what he had just heard. That sentence, simple and devastating, cut through all the defenses he had built up throughout his life. There was no insult, no bitterness, and that was precisely why it hurt so much. As she strutted down the runway, the audience rose to their feet in ecstasy. The cameras captured every movement, every detail of the woman who rose from the ashes with more brilliance than any diamond. Jaemin, unable to look away, felt the weight of each applause like a personal blow. It was as if the universe applauded her strength and condemned him for what he had done. When the show ended, Ha-eun thanked the audience and disappeared backstage, surrounded by journalists and flashbulbs. He remained seated alone, feeling small amidst the sound of applause that didn't belong to him. For the first time, the man who had everything realized what it truly meant to lose. What money can't buy: respect, love, and forgiveness. Still dazed, Jaemin stood up and walked slowly backstage. Each step was a silent confession of guilt. Security tried to stop him, but he persisted, saying only her name. The echo of Yoon Ha-eun echoed in the hallway, but no response came, only the distant sound of cameras and voices celebrating her triumph. He leaned against the wall and took a deep breath, feeling something inside him begin to crumble. His empire, his pride, the persona he'd created to hide his cowardice. And as Paris applauded the woman reborn, Kang Jae-min realized that the true judgment was yet to come. Fate was not finished, and what came next would make him understand that some wounds never heal, even when forgiveness seems granted. That night was etched in Kang Jae-min's mind like an endless echo. The hotel in Paris was luxurious, but the room seemed too small for the guilt that accompanied him. Sitting in the armchair facing the window, he watched the city lights and tried to understand when success had turned into punishment. Images of the fashion show played back repeatedly. Ha-eun's serene gaze, her smile, the sound of applause. Everything he had once despised now shone brighter than any trophy on his shelf. In the following days, headlines took over the news portals. Korean CEO gets emotional after seeing ex-wife triumph in Paris. The photos showed him with teary eyes, and social media commented mercilessly. Some spoke of regret, others of irony. Jaemin avoided reading, but the words found him anyway. It was impossible to escape something that lived inside him. Deciding to talk to Ha-eun, he looked for the contact information for the team at Renaud House. He waited for hours at the reception desk, watching models and reporters come and go. Finally, a security guard approached and asked his name. Upon hearing this, the man simply shook his head and replied firmly, "She doesn't want to be interrupted during the success you doubted." She would have? The sentence hit him hard. He stood still for a few seconds, his heart sinking. It was as if the whole world were returning in a single line, the contempt he'd hurled years before. He walked back to the hotel in silence, unable to face his own reflection. For the first time, he understood what Ha-eun had felt the day he left, the feeling of being ignored, erased, invisible. That night, he looked at his phone and opened her social media profile. The latest post contained a simple sentence: "Pain is the most expensive fabric I have ever worn, but it is pain that has made me unique." Jaemin read and reread those words, trying to understand how she had managed to transform suffering into beauty. He, who had spent his life avoiding everything that hurt, now realized that perhaps that was precisely what was preventing him from living. The hours passed, but the regret didn't. He thought about looking for her again, about apologizing, but something held him back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was fear. Fear of discovering there was no longer any room for him in her life. And in a way, this uncertainty was his punishment. The next morning, before boarding the plane back to Seoul, Jaemin looked out the plane window and saw the sun rising over Paris. For the first time, he understood what Ha-eun had meant when she called him the man who couldn't see the light. The sun blinded him, but it also reminded him that there is always a dawn, even for those who have slept in the dark for too long. But fate wasn't finished with him yet, because true repentance isn't the kind you feel in silence. It's the kind that forces you to face to face the person you destroyed. And soon, the definitive reunion between forgiveness and guilt would confront both of them with the outcome that would forever change their lives. The days following the show were unlike anything Ha-eun had experienced. Paris embraced her as the artist reborn from pain, and people wanted to hear her story. Interviews, invitations, campaigns. The name Yoon Ha-eun was now synonymous with strength and elegance. But beneath the shine lay serenity. She knew that no success was worth anything without peace. So, instead of losing herself in fame, she sought silence. The same silence that once brought her down, now strengthened her. In her studio, among fabrics and dried flowers, she maintained her habit of sewing alone. Each new piece was a reminder of who she had been, of all she had endured, and how much she had transformed. There was no longer any hatred in her heart, no desire for revenge, only gratitude for having survived a pain many could not bear. When asked about her ex-husband, she would respond calmly, "I don't hold anger. Some pains come to refine what is still raw within us." And these words, spoken calmly, sounded more powerful than any revenge. With the money from the show, Ha-eun created a charity fund for women undergoing cancer treatment. She called the Project Renaissance. She offered emotional support, handmade scarves and self-esteem talks. With each story she heard, she saw herself reflected, not as a victim, but as an example. Her name crossed borders, but what really mattered was seeing those women smile again. That was what kept her going. One silent night, Minju asked if she still thought about Kang Jae-min. Ha-eun replied, looking out the window, "Yes, I do, but in a light-hearted way. He was part of my destruction, but also part of my awakening." Her friend smiled, understanding that forgiveness, when genuine, frees the one who gives it. Ha-eun fell asleep that night, with her soul at peace, never imagining that, on the other side of the world, the man who abandoned her was still struggling to find rest. And it's precisely when the heart finds peace that fate decides to test its real meaning. Ha-eun believed the past was finally behind her, but fate, with its sharp irony, was about to bring it back, not with pain, but with a look that begged for redemption. Back in Seoul, Kang Jae-min was no longer the same man who left. The office walls seemed narrower, the sound of employees on the phone sounded distant, and the glass mirror reflecting his image only revealed an emptiness that even he could not disguise. The trip to Paris had stripped him of everything that sustained him: pride, vanity, power. For the first time, he saw himself not as the CEO who had conquered the world, but as the man who destroyed the only true love he had ever known. News about Ha-eun continued to surface everywhere. Every magazine, every video, every news report reminded him of what he had lost through cowardice. At night, sitting on his penthouse, he gazed at the city's skyscrapers and thought that no amount of achievement could ever restore what he had let die. Silence, once a sign of control, was now a sentence. At times he would even attempt a message, a letter, some attempt at redemption, but he would delete it before sending it. He knew she no longer owed him anything, not even a reply. Still, an impulse drove him to the hotel where he'd learned Ha-eun would be staying for a press conference in Seoul. He waited in the lobby for hours, a bouquet of white flowers in his hands. When he finally saw her step off the elevator, time seemed to rewind. Ha-eun wore a simple dress, the same serene look that had tormented him. Jae-min stood, and for a moment, their eyes met. She hesitated, recognizing him, but didn't approach. He stepped forward and spoke, his voice low and trembling. "I ran away from the illness, Ha-eun, but I was the one who was sick." She watched him for a few seconds, and in that gaze was compassion, not love, not hate, just the peace of someone who's already forgiven. There was no response, just a gentle nod before she turned and walked away, leaving behind the man who now understood the true meaning of loneliness. Jae-min stood there, holding the flowers, until he realized they had wilted in his hands. That night, he wrote in his diary for the first time in years. The words flowed like a confession. "Her pain healed me, even without her knowing it. Everything I tried to bury blossomed before my eyes." He closed the notebook and realized that regret is a prison without bars, and that forgiveness sometimes is the harshest sentence. The wind blew hard outside, rustling the apartment's curtains. Through the window, he saw the moon reflected in the tall buildings, and it was in that reflection that for the first time he saw himself for what he truly was, a small man before the greatness of the woman he had learned to love alone. But fate still had one last scene in store, the cruelest and most beautiful of all, because karma, patient and just, waited for the right moment to cross their paths again, no longer as husband and wife, but as two destinies so opposite they needed to face each other one last time under the lights of the same stage. Months passed, and Korea was buzzing with anticipation. A major fashion charity event was to be held in Seoul, bringing together the industry's biggest names, and among them was Yoon Ha-eun. It was her triumphant return to the country that had seen her depart in humiliation. Newspapers carried headlines extolling her career, and the public eagerly awaited to see her on the runway again, this time as a symbol of overcoming obstacles. The stage was set in the heart of the city, in a mirrored pavilion that reflected the night sky, as if the universe itself were watching. Kang Jae-min, though he tried to avoid it, couldn't resist. He bought a discreet ticket without the company name and sat in the last row among anonymous people. The expensive suit and tired look no longer matched the arrogant man he'd once been. There was something simpler about him, and infinitely sadder. With every minute, the tension grew. He knew this wouldn't be just a fashion show. It would be the final verdict on what remained between them. The lights dimmed, and the hall fell silent. Then a soft melody began to play, a slow, almost spiritual soundtrack. The models emerged one by one, wearing creations that seemed made of hope and scars, flowing fabrics, shades of silver and white, as if each dress told a story of someone who had survived pain. The audience watched mesmerized, but nothing compared to the moment Ha-eun appeared. She appeared at center stage, wearing a long pearly grey silk dress whose texture resembled the moon's glow. She walked slowly, with the lightness of someone who no longer carried any weight. Each step was a buried memory, each glance at the audience a silent farewell. When she reached the end of the catwalk, she stopped. The audience awaited her final gesture, but no one expected what came next. With a smooth movement, Ha-eun lifted her hands and removed the silk scarf covering part of her head. The scar, discreet, was exposed under the lights. For a moment, the entire hall fell silent. No whispers, no camera clicks, just pent-up breathing. Then someone began to applaud, another followed. Within seconds, the entire auditorium rose to its feet. The sound of applause echoed like thunder, and tears welled in even the most skeptical eyes. In the crowd, Kang Jae-min also stood up, unable to hold back his tears. The image of her there, so vivid, so strong, hit him with the force of all the wrong choices he'd ever made. In that moment, there was no more CEO, no past, no guilt, just a man, applauding the woman who had the courage to keep going when he'd given up. Ha-eun looked out at the audience, and for a brief moment, her eyes met his. There was no rancor, just a serene smile, a silent farewell. She knew this would be the end of any earthly bond between them, and the beginning of a peace neither of them had known before. When the curtains closed, Jae-min remained there, motionless, applauding the emptiness as if trying to immortalize a moment he knows will never return. But even fate, when it concludes its cycle, still likes to leave one last memory. And as the runway lights dimmed, something inside Ha-eun told her that this wouldn't just be the end of a story, it would be the beginning of a new mission, where love would cease to be pain and become a legacy. Years had passed since that fashion show that marked the end of one era and the birth of another. Yoon Ha-eun now lived surrounded by flowers and silence in a secluded house near the mountains of Jeju. There, the sound of wind and waves replaced the applause, and time slowed down, allowing her to breathe the peace she so longed for. In the morning, she would open the windows and let the sun shine in, illuminating the fabrics and frames she kept as heirlooms. The collection reborn became a global symbol of resilience and self-love, inspiring women on every continent. Ha-eun never walked the runway again, but every interview, every word, was an extension of her new mission, to heal through beauty. During one of these interviews, a reporter asked her if she believed she had completely forgiven the man who abandoned her. She smiled sweetly, looked into the distance, and replied, "Forgiveness isn't forgetting what was done to you. It's understanding that every wound has a purpose. Love didn't heal me. What healed me was believing I could still love myself." Her words spread around the world, touching thousands of hearts still struggling with abandonment, rejection, and fear. Meanwhile, in a small Seoul apartment, Kang Jae-min lived out of the spotlight. He had sold part of his company and dedicated his time to lectures on ethics and humanity in business. He rarely spoke about the past, but everyone knew there was regret in every gesture. One cold night, he turned on the television and saw Ha-eun being honored in a documentary about resilience. Her face, serene and untouchable, filled the room. For a few minutes, he simply smiled, a sad but sincere smile. Finally, he turned off the set, opened a box, and held out the wedding ring he had kept for years. He murmured to himself, "The sparkle I sought in diamonds was in her heart." Outside, the rain began to fall softly. It was as if fate itself was washing away the past, ending a story of pain and rebirth. Ha-eun, across the sea, looked up at the sky and felt the same rain touch her face. Neither of them knew it, but in that moment, the universe finally sealed the cycle. And so ends the story of Yoon Ha-eun, the woman who proved that pain doesn't destroy, it only reveals who we truly are. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and continue following stories that show that even when all seems lost, love and destiny always find a new beginning.